Hey, AP Euro. So I'm going to make some notes about the French Revolution. Keep looking at your crash course books and your review books, and also the AP guides. Those videos that they're making are great. I hope this just helps you to. This is sort of the way I taught it, and so as a way of reviewing it and incorporate this knowledge into your other knowledge of it. And so when I think of the French Revolution or any revolution, I think of, okay, what were they revolting against? So I got to think of what the status quo is, and then in terms of revolutions, I have to think of what are the different phases, because usually there are different phases of a revolution. And so with this, you start off with the old regime in France. And with the old regime, this goes back to pretty much since we've been studying it. But, think of, if you need to think of ideas about how the old regime is, one, think of the way we were sitting in class. So the way we were sitting in class is we had the church. Remember, we're sitting over there, the first estate. France was in 3 estates. You had the church, you had the nobility, nobles, second estate, and then you had the third estate, everybody else, and everybody else includes, you had peasants, and you had the urban poor. The peasants are the vast majority. I think it's around 85% of all people. Again, nobles are small. I think that's like 2% of people. Church, around 2%. This is 1% or maybe 1% or 2%, but you got the idea. Urban poor, I want to say it's around, 12%. And again, this is rough. And then over here, you've got the bourgeoisie, bourgeoisie. So all these guys are part of the third estate. Right? And then who's on top of everyone? You've got the king. And because it's a patriarchal lineage, the king has all the power, but the queen is also there too. And she becomes important in this because of the connections that the king has. And in France, this is sort of how it broke down. What are causes of revolution? So first think of the causes. The causes are usually, there are intellectual ideas that are the cause. There are also inequality. There's also weak leadership that happens during the time of a revolution. Think of Tsar Nicholas II in Russia during that one. Think of Charles I in England during that. They were weak leaders. They couldn't. And in this case, you have Louis XVI. Don't get him confused with Louis XIV, who was a very strong leader. Let's see. Also, during this revolution, what's going to exacerbate or make it worse is going to be war. Just like how the Russian Revolution, World War I, makes it so much worse and hastens the destruction. War, in this case, is going to hasten the destruction of this. The intellectual ideas that are going around from my last video are the ones of the Enlightenment. And think of the Enlightenment, right? It's challenging the ideas of the system. It's challenging in favor of democracy. It's challenging in favor of, at least with the bourgeoisie, people with property having life and liberty. It's challenging the power, absolute power of the king with Montesquieu and putting it into 3 different parts. It's challenging the rights and privileges of nobles through ideas of Rousseau, who asked, why are, we say men are born free, but you find them everywhere in chains. And so the ideas of the Enlightenment are challenging this. However, the Enlightenment is really about the bourgeoisie. It's literate people who are making these arguments. The vast majority of people who are going to rise up during this revolution are going to be fighting about inequality. A lot of it has to do with the tax system, where the bourgeoisie, the whole third estate, they have to pay 50% of what they own to in taxes. The nobility pay 0%. The church pay a 2% contribution in taxes. But of course, the church gets a tithe from the peasants. The nobles also get tithes from the peasants. And the king and queen, the way that they've been spending, aside from inequality in this tax system, also in privileges that come with feudalism. Think back to feudalism. That's still nobles are controlling these peasants on the property. They're the ones who are doling out justice through torture and public humiliation. And so the other major problem that is going to be leading the country into revolution is going to be debt. And why is France in debt? Part of it is from usually your spending in war creates huge debts. And this is the war of generations before them, except for Louis, especially Louis XIV, XIV, who his wars, also the wars supported by Louis XV. The French supported the Americans in the American Revolution just so they could beat the British, right? They didn't want to have a revolution at their own, but the ideas of the American Revolution, the success of the American Revolution, and especially because the French are supporting the Americans against the British, that's another cause of the French Revolution. You have all these different things, and the Enlightenment ideas, this unfair tax system and privileges, a weak king, Louis XVI. You have debt that comes from war from the previous kings. Also, the spending of Louis and his queen. Remember, they live an extravagant lifestyle. And this is juxtaposed, or it's opposed to the idea that during the same time there are tough winters in the 1780s, and there's famine and lack of food. And so debt, I guess I'd put that into inequality and lack of food. Remember, people practice subsistence farming. France has not adopted the agricultural revolution, even though the techniques of it, even though it's going on in England. And so when there's an especially rough winter or flooding, then that's going to cause people to go hungry. There's not going to be surpluses of food. And so all of this swirls together to cause a situation ripe for revolution. And so it starts with, so this is the old regime. Come into focus. There you go. You're going to have a period of constitutional monarchy. These are the phases of the revolution, where there's going to be a king in charge of like a parliament. Then you're going to have a period of the Reign of Terror, which is the radical phase. So you're going to have a liberal phase. You're going to have a radical phase. And then you're going to have a Napoleonic Empire. And Napoleon's empire, it's a mix of there are parts of it that's liberal, there are parts of it that's reactionary or goes back to that moment. And then, of course, he's destroyed, and then there's a restoration of a monarch afterward. Okay, and so it goes in these phases. The first phase, why does it become a constitutional monarchy? There's the Estates General, and the Estates General is like what Parliament is in England, except in France, the king has hardly ever had to call it together, and representatives of the first, second, and third estates gather, and this is because the king needs money. Just like with Charles I in the English Revolution, the king needs money, so he has to go to Parliament to raise taxes. And so the Estates General hadn't been called in something like 175 years, but Louis XVI was deeply in debt and needed to call for his nobles and the people in order to make a change in the tax system. And during this time, a bunch of the French came with grievances They're called doléances and cahiers de doléances, and they're people from different towns, from the bourgeoisie, coming with these critiques of French society. You also had nobles who weren't going to budge. They wanted to continue to have their privileges and pay 0% taxes. And the church also, for the most part, except for a couple exceptions like the Abbé Sieyès, didn't want to change their status either. And so what ends up happening at the Estates General, the short of it, is that the Third Estate walks out when there's that vote, either order or by head, and they can't agree how to vote. The Third Estate is locked out, and they come up with a tennis court oath. And the tennis court oath is where members of the Third Estate, and it's really the bourgeoisie, it's not really the ideas of the urban poor or the peasants. The beginning part's a pretty bourgeois revolution. They agree that they need to write a constitution. Constitution. Oh man, that says constitution. That's what they're going to do. And they end up doing it. And so this is sort of the bourgeois solution to that. At the same time, and again, this is in 1789, beforehand in this old regime, man, let's just say it's just basically say 1450 to 1789. So this bourgeois reaction to the Estates General. You also have some violent reactions. You have the Women's March to Versailles, where this is pretty much the urban poor. These women are they rise up because they're protesting the price of bread, and they go to the palace and demand that the king and the family give bread. They say, we're looking for the baker's wife and the baker's kids, and they kill some guards and put their heads on pikes, and then they take them, the royal family, back to Paris, so they're not in Versailles anymore. And so this is more of the reaction of the urban poor. This is a reaction of the bougies, the bourgeoisie, for the tennis court oath. And then the peasants in the countryside, there's something called the Great Fear. All these things are happening pretty much simultaneously. The Great Fear, and this is burning nobles' homes. Oh man, that says burning nobles' homes. And let's see, burning nobles' homes. And they're doing it to destroy feudalism, because the nobles have, basically, they've got these documents that say that if you live on this land, then I own you, and I own the people who are born after you onto this land. And so they're burning down these documents and the nobles' homes. And so this is a peasant uprising. And now, do the peasants care about having a constitutional monarchy or, Montesquieu's ideas? No, they don't. They care about not being controlled by the nobles anymore. They want to have food. Similarly, the Women's March to Versailles, they want bread. They want this kind of fairness. What you're going to see with the bourgeois and what they create, they're going to have different ideas of what they want versus what the urban poor want versus what the peasants want, and you're going to see them come into conflict with each other. But in the beginning, also the urban poor, besides the Women's March to Versailles, there's also the Bastille prison is invaded, and the guards are killed and prisoners are released, and that's because they think that Austrians are invading Paris. Remember, Marie Antoinette, our queen, is from Austria. And so if her family hears about the queen being in danger or being overthrown, they're going to come in and try to rescue her. And at the same time, they're afraid of democracy spreading. They want to keep their power in Austria. Similarly, in Prussia, they want to keep their absolutism strong there. And so they don't want democracy to spread. And so they're going to team up to invade France. So there's a period of constitutional monarchy from about 1789 to 1793. And during this time, there's a National Assembly, and the National Assembly is making laws, but the king is not is not in good faith the leader, and he does a lot of vetoing. As we saw, though, veto by king, we did see that he does allow for a new device, an Enlightenment idea of execution called the guillotine, which is allowed and becomes the national means of execution, which the king should have vetoed, I would think. So how does it change from constitutional monarchy to reign of terror? Well, it's because during this time, the king tries to escape. And so this is known as the liberal phase during the time of the National Assembly. That's because it's being, think of liberal, meaning these are the ideas of the Enlightenment. Okay? Think of Montesquieu. Think of John Locke, people with life, liberty, and property. It is a constitutional monarch. And we also went through what they create too is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Declaration of the Rights of Man. And we looked through and we looked at all of the different parts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the different articles. And in that, we were able to connect it to different Enlightenment thinkers, whether it was rule of law in Rousseau or fair criminal justice system in Beccaria or John Locke's life, liberty, and property. This is the phase of government that is a liberal, that is a constitutional monarchy. Okay, it changes when war happens. And so this radical phase of the revolution, there's war, Austria and Prussia invade France. So war by Austria and Prussia invade France. And this period of the reign of terror starts. It's found that the king, he's found to be guilty of treason, of supporting the Austrians and the Prussians. And so the reign of terror starts with the death of the king. And then you have a much more radical phase of the French Revolution. And by radical, it's think back to the person who's in control, Robespierre, and the Committee of Public Safety. And this is the Enlightenment gone wrong. It's actually pretty similar to some of what happened in communism. It's Lenin liked these guys. He wanted a Jacobin also. And remember these far leftists, they're called Jacobins. Also, they wore the Phrygian caps, those red caps. And we also have sans culottes, sans without culottes, the ass pants. Remember the tight noble pants? And so the sans culottes are the urban poor who are wearing pants and who have radical ideas. And those radical ideas include de-Christianization, remember, the churches are destroyed. The calendar is totally changed in order to get rid of any Christian symbolism or dates. And during this time, there's also the use of terror to create a better society. Virtue through terror. Think of any intense radical, and I even think of Osama bin Laden and people like that who use terror in order to create what they believe to be a perfect society. And there's also intense surveillance of people. You can't give the old greetings like Madame or Monsieur. They're trying to wipe away all of the old regime. And so nobles are targeted. The church is targeted. And during this time, you have nobles trying to escape, who are known as émigrés. And even heroes like the Marquis de Lafayette, who helped write the Declaration of the Rights of Man, he is arrested and thrown in jail. During this time, even though they're extremely radical, they aren't so radical as to accept the calls of Olympe de Gouges, who writes the Declaration of the Rights of Women. Declaration of the Rights of Women, who argues that women deserve to have economic rights the right to have a divorce, and the right to vote. And what happens to her during this time? She is executed for treason. Treason. We also looked at Jean-Paul Marat during this phase. Marat is a newspaper man who's calling for the death of anyone who's disloyal. And then he's murdered by Charlotte Corday. If you remember that, in his bathtub. He had a skin condition and lived in his bathtub. And so this is an example of, he's spreading lies in his newspaper and calling for blood. And this is the use of this media, and then even more violence being caused through that. And so he's another figure during that time. So newspaper guy murdered by Charlotte Corday and then made into a martyr because they don't worship Christ anymore. They make up their own martyrs, and Marat was one of them. Finally, how does the Reign of Terror end? It starts with the execution of the king, and it ends with the execution of Robespierre. Is execution of Robespierre. And just look back over that. And remember in class, we were in different committees of public safety, and people were being executed based on their ideology or based on their beliefs, trying to see if they were conservative, meaning, so conservative would be up here, if they agree in the old regime and having kings and the church, or are they liberals? Are they in favor of a constitutional monarchy? Or are they radicals in favor of destruction of the church, wiping away everything from before and starting fresh, and using terror to do so? You get to Napoleon, and Napoleon, similar to Oliver Cromwell, after the execution of the king, this guy he rules as a dictator under the guise of democracy, dictatorship. And how does he become the emperor? Well, it's pretty much because there's this war going on between Austria and Prussia during the whole French Revolution. There's a war inside France during this reign of terror in the revolution against the different parts of society, but then there's a war outside against Austria and Prussia, who are invading. And so Napoleon is a brilliant general who he rises up from colonel all the way up to general, and has these victories, and even after defeating Austria himself, negotiates the terms of their surrender. He's not even a representative of the government. He's just a general, and he does it himself. And so he's extremely ambitious, and he leads a coup d'état, or a golpe de estado, a seizure of power. And we looked at that cartoon of the crocodile and the Council of Frogs, the Corsican crocodile. Remember, he's not even from mainland France. He's from the island of Corsica. He grew up speaking something close to Italian, and so he's always felt a little bit like an outsider. He's extremely intelligent, and part of his, we also think of his accomplishments. So think of his accomplishments and his failures, and that's a way to remember what goes on during Napoleon. Accomplishments were the Napoleonic Code, which were uniform laws, basically the same laws throughout France to apply to all people. And he gave schooling, or the lycées, to all men, regardless of rank or class. We saw that even though he's giving lots of positive things in terms of class, it's still very patriarchal, and we looked at some of those rules in the Napoleonic Code that were especially patriarchal. Like a woman can't get a divorce unless the husband is cheating on her in her own house, and which is why Napoleon had many houses and two wives too. Anyway, uniform laws, schooling. He got territory for France, however, he was also very cronyistic. When he would take over a new place, he would loot, he would steal, he would put his relatives in charge. And so some of his problems had to do with his intense ego and empire building. And so one was the continental system, He wanted to have an embargo on Great Britain that failed, or a blockade. Blockade on Britain failed. Of course, Britain, by this time, this was a failure of a blockade on Britain, and because Britain had the most powerful navy, and so doing something where you're trying to stop the British from shipping is not a smart idea. His other big mistake was the Peninsular War, and that was in Spain. And you can think back to the Goya painting that we studied, and there's the Spanish guerrillas, the guerrilla warfare, and then the French atrocities against the Spanish people. 300,000 French soldiers end up dying in Spain during this war. And then another 300,000 die in the invasion of Russia. And that is, that's pretty much, it's not the death blow to Napoleon, but it's pretty much what ensures that he is going to fail. He's later defeated at Waterloo in Belgium, but that's after the invasion of Russia, where 300,000 of his men die. So these are his big mistakes: continental system, Peninsular War, invasion of Russia. His successes: the Napoleonic Code, these uniform laws, schooling, getting more territory. Oh, also the Concordat, where he brings back the church and gives more normalcy in society. Brings back church. He also brings the nobles back. And so he tries to sort of restore some of what made France, restore some of the security to France, yet also he tries to give more rights and also a fair taxation system, fair taxes. And France is no longer in debt. So he's able to do lots of successes, although these big failures end up destroying the Napoleonic Empire. And when he's defeated by the Quadruple Alliance and Metternich, they put a king, Louis the 18th, back on the throne, wiping out a lot of the gains made during the French Revolution. And it goes back to a system similar to this by 1815. Okay, that's the French Revolution.